Side effects of the myth. Looking back in history, there's no shortage of examples of man's inhumanity to man. Examples of oppression and suffering, violence and hatreds, and situations and events which do not reflect well on the human race in general. And though many of the most blatant injustices in history were the obvious product of the belief in government, such as war and overt oppression, many other injustices which are not usually attributed to government action would also have been impossible without the involvement of authority. In addition to the example of whether slavery could have existed had it not been legally enforced as mentioned above, similar questions could be asked about the treatment of American Indians. If not for the authoritarian government edicts and the state mercenaries to enforce them, would there have been such a large-scale concerted effort to exterminate or forcibly evict the Native Americans from the lands they had inhabited for generations? No doubt there still would have been similar conflicts due to the clash of cultures and demands for farming and hunting lands, but would it have been in anyone's personal interest to engage in large-scale violent combat? After open slavery was ended in the United States, at about the same time that legal slavery, the income tax, first came into being, racial tensions and violent conflicts continued. Many believe that government then came along and saved the day. In reality, violent conflicts between the races was encouraged by authority. For many years, racial segregation was forcibly imposed via laws. Ironically, racial tensions were later exacerbated further by government-mandated integration, which sought to coerce people of different races and cultures to mix, whether they wanted to or not. Again, the result was violence. During the entire fiasco, some businesses and schools, if left in freedom, would have chosen segregation, and some would have chosen integration. If not for government trying to forcibly impose one official policy on everyone, parents could simply have chosen which schools to send their children to, segregated or not, and shoppers simply could have chosen which businesses to patronize, segregated or not. Not only was much of the violence committed against blacks done directly by government enforcers, the police, but even much of the privately committed violence was the result of anger over the people being forced by government to deal with people of another race and culture. It is silly to think that forcing people apart or forcing people together will make people happier, nicer, or more open-minded and tolerant. In neither case was the peace or security of either race served by authoritarian intervention. While it is impossible to say exactly how widespread or prolonged segregation and racism would have been without government involvement, it is common sense that if people of all races and religions were allowed the freedom to choose who to associate with, it at least makes it possible for very different cultures to peacefully coexist. But when government gets involved and the debate is between forcing races to remain separate or forcing races to mingle, obviously some people will be angered either way, and rightfully so. This is not to say that every viewpoint is equally valid. The point is that people of vastly different worldviews, however wiser, stupid, open-minded, or bigoted, informed, or ignorant their views may be, can usually coexist peacefully even in close proximity unless government gets involved. Different people may not like each other, may not condemn other cultures, or many people may in fact harshly criticize or condemn other cultures. But that does not mean they cannot peacefully coexist with both sides refraining from violent aggression. But whenever government gets involved, the coercion inherent in all law makes certain people that people will not just get along. The coercion inherent in all law makes certain that people will not just get along. Another example of the indirect effects of government action is the fact that the violence associated with the drug trade, prohibition and distribution of illegal substances, exists only because of narcotics laws. By outlawing a substance or a behavior, even when all of the participants are willing adults, the politicians create a black market which not only has a huge profit potential due to limiting the supply, but creates a situation which specifically deprives customers and suppliers of any legal protection. For example, if a drug dealer is robbed or assaulted by the police or by anyone else, he is unlikely to call law enforcers to help him. Outlawing something consensual, whether it be prostitution, gambling, or drug use, almost guarantees that the market will be controlled by whatever gang is the most violent or has paid off the most cops and other officials. Again, a perfect before and after example of this was alcohol prohibition in the United States. When alcohol became illegal, it was immediately taken over by organized crime, which was renowned not only for its violence, but also for its ability to bribe government agents and officials. When alcohol became legal again, all of the related violence stopped almost instantly. Despite that crystal clear example of how the horrible results of enacting laws to prohibit vices, most people still support laws against behaviors and habits they find distasteful. As a result, the related violence continues. Instead of being recognized as a problem which exists because of government and its laws, it is still imagined to be a problem which government must fight against. The same could be said of the infamous violence of loan sharks who deal with illegal gambling and the violence of pimps in places where prostitution is illegal. In such cases, even better than a before and after comparison is a side-by-side comparison. Does gambling lead to more violence in Atlantic City, where it is legal, or in places where it is illegal? Does prostitution pose a bigger threat to all involved in Amsterdam, where it is legal, or in all of the places where it is illegal? This is not to say that prostitution, gambling, and drugs, including alcohol, are good things, but that, good or bad, introducing the coercion of government into the situation does not do away with such vices, but only makes them more dangerous for everyone involved and often for people who are not involved. Lest anyone still imagine that such vice laws are the result of good intentions, the politicians are well aware that gambling, prostitution, and illegal drug use still occur in government prisons. The politicians know full well that even if constant captivity, surveillance, random searches, and harsh punishments cannot prevent such behaviors in people who are kept in closely monitored cages, laws obviously cannot eradicate such behaviors from an entire country. But they can, and do, supply tyrants with a ready excuse for an ever-expanding power, and that is exactly why governments enact vice laws to begin with, to create crime where there was none, in an attempt to justify the existence of authoritarian power and control. In a world without the myth of authority, many people, including this author, would still strongly disapprove of drug use, prostitution, and other vices, but they would be unlikely to support efforts to have such behaviors violently suppressed. Not only would they usually feel unjustified in advocating violence if they did not have the excuse of authority to hide behind, but they would be likely to want to provide the billions of dollars necessary to wage a large-scale, violent campaign against such widespread activities. Even the most judgmental person would have both economic and moral incentives to leave others in peace, as well as the fear of retaliation from any he chose to commit acts of aggression against. Of course, open criticism of lifestyles and behaviors and attempts to persuade people to change their ways are a perfectly acceptable part of human society. In fact, if people had to try to use reason and verbal persuasion to win people over, instead of using the brute force of government, perhaps the targets would be more open to listening. At the very least, people would no longer turn an issue of bad habits into an issue of bloodshed and brutality, as happens now with all attempts to legislate morality. The flip side of the notion that if it's illegal it must be bad is if it's legal it must be okay. Perhaps the biggest example of this is the fact that in 1913, the U.S. government not only legalized slavery via the income tax, directly and forcibly confiscating the fruits of people's labor, but also, by way of the Federal Reserve Act, legalized a level of counterfeiting and bank fraud which boggles the mind. In short, the politicians gave bankers legal permission to make up money out of thin air and loan such fake fabricated money at interest to others, including governments. Though most people are unaware of the specifics of how such huge frauds and robberies occur via fiat currencies and fractional reserve banking, many people now have a gut instinct that the banks are doing something deceptive and corrupt. What they fail to realize is that it was government which gave the banks permission to defraud and swindle the public out of literally trillions of dollars. Another particularly controversial example of how a debate of legality can trump a debate about facts and morality is the issue of abortion. One side lobbies for an authority to make or keep abortion legal and then defends the practice based upon its legality. The other side pushes for abortion to be outlawed in hopes of having the violence of authority used to prevent the practice. In logical terms, the only relevant question, which is a religious, biological, philosophical question, not a legal question, is, at what point does the fetus count as a person? The answer to that question dictates whether abortion amounts to murder or is the equivalent of having a kidney removed. However, instead of addressing the only question that actually matters, as complex and controversial as it may be, both sides usually focus instead on trying to get the violence of authority on their side. As another example of legalized injustice, almost everyone is aware of how outrageous and irrational lawsuits have become. Example, trespassing criminals successfully suing property owners after injuring themselves during a break-in. But they fail to realize that it is the decrees of government-appointed judges which allow it to happen at all. In addition to government being able to legally steal from one person to give to another, government also creates, via the current system of litigation, a mechanism whereby one person can directly and legally rob another. Laws in the name of environmentalism are also used for immoral power grabs in both directions. With enough money, a company which is actually polluting and thus infringing on the property rights of others can trade campaign contributions for legal permission to pollute. At the same time, they can use environmental laws to crush competition by creating and enforcing a maze of environmental regulations, many of them unnecessary or counterproductive, sometimes idiotic, to keep smaller companies out of the market. Additionally, politicians can use vague threats of environmental dangers as an excuse to gain control of private industry, to control the behavior of millions, or to extort more money for their own purposes. In many industries, success now depends less on providing a valuable service at a reasonable price than it does upon obtaining special favors and preferential treatment from government. This can be in the form of direct handouts, grants or subsidies, political trading, no-bid government contracts, licensing schemes, such as in the medical industry, tariffs on international trade, regulatory control and favoritism, and many other means. The results of all of these high prices, inferior products and services, fewer choices, and so on, is often assumed to be the result of the shortcomings of private industry instead of being recognized for what it is: the adverse consequences of authoritarian control over human interaction. Major economic crashes are always the result of government tampering with commerce, credit, and currencies. Short of a total destruction, the only way to destroy an entire economy is to meddle with the medium of exchange, the money, through legalized counterfeiting via the issuance of fabricated credit and the insurance of fiat currency. Most people, being ignorant of even basic economics, view inflation and other economic problems as a natural, unfortunate, but unavoidable occurrence. In truth, they are symptoms of large-scale, legalized fraud and theft. Immigration laws give another example of indirect damage and secondary problems caused by government. Aside from the obvious direct coercion involved, such laws cause other problems that would not exist otherwise, including the lucrative, often vicious racket of smuggling illegals into the country. 2. Illegals being easily targeted for human trafficking and other forms of exploitation because they do not dare speak out or help. 3. People being forced to live under tyrannical regimes because they cannot physically escape, and because illegals are already classified as criminals and often viewed as undesirables simply for being in the country and receive neither respect nor protection from much of the citizenry. There is less of an incentive for them to otherwise behave in a law-abiding manner. Even many problems that seem to be non-governmental in nature exist because of some law. Of course there are and always will be instances of fraud and theft committed by unscrupulous individuals acting on their own. But most people are completely unaware of how many seemingly private swindles, schemes, and rackets are not only allowed by authority, but encouraged and rewarded by the laws of government, whether intentionally or accidentally. Having no truly free market to compare it to, many continue to assume that state coercion is necessary, when all it actually does is hinder and interfere with human productivity and prerogative.